So following the anti-government protests in the Kisumu and Kisii counties in Kenya last month, Amnesty International and the Medical Association and Law Society in the country conducted a visit to communities to assess the aftermath. Between 19 and 21 July, 10 people were killed and 107 injured as a result of excessive force by police members. To tell us more about the findings of the report, we are joined by Amnesty International Executive Director Irungu Houghton. He joins us from Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you very much, Mr. Houghton, for your time this afternoon. This is not a new issue in Kenya. The international justice system published a report where it spoke about 1 in 3 Kenyans having experienced police abuse or harassment. Over 500 killings by police in Kenya have been documented between 2019 and 2021. We're not even speaking of the 2017 post-election violence. What do we need to understand about the history of police brutality in Kenya?
Thank you very much. About a decade ago, we released a public opinion survey, and one of the things that shocked us tremendously was that more Kenyans feared police brutality than poverty, which in a country of 47% below the poverty line, that is really shocking. We've had 9 rounds of what we call in Kenya mandamano. These are public protests against the cost of living. They have been organized by the opposition party Azimio, and they have raised a number of concerns with regards to the 2022 elections. But the last round, the period, the 3 days between 19 and 21st of July were probably some of those violence. So a joint mission of the Kenya Medical Association, Law Society of Kenya and Amnesty International Kenya, exactly 1 week from now, was in Kisumu and Kisii to essentially establish whether crimes against humanity and genocide had taken place.
What did you find?
Well, it was really traumatic, and I just, I tried not to speak personally, but the impact, I think, for me was quite emotional. We spoke to patients, we talked to survivors of police violence, and we talked to doctors, lawyers, prosecutors, and investigators. So it was a broad spectrum of different state actors and civilians. And what we found was that 10 people lost their lives over 3 days, and something like about 107 people were seriously injured and had to be hospitalized for injuries. 47 of those 107 were essentially hospitalized as a result of shootings by police officers, and just under half of the people who died died as a result of either being shot with live bullets or with rubber bullets at very close range. So it is a terrible moment in many ways for the criminal justice system, and we do hope that the state will learn from essentially what is violent policing. We heard stories of people being pulled from their homes, young men who were beaten in front of their families. We also had stories of parents who, fearing that the evidence would be tampered with, had to reach into their families' bodies to retrieve bullets so that they could hand them over to the Independent Policing Oversight Authority. So very gory stories and very traumatic, but it's also a moment really of there's glimmers of hope in that, because we did hear from police officers who refused to assault civilians, who de-escalated situations. We had doctors who had to pass through very dangerous neighborhoods, threatened either by police officers or by violent criminals, to be able to get to hospital and to treat people. So, there are a number of, I guess, there are also some good stories to be told in this. But ultimately, we found that based on this 3-day mission, that the threshold of crimes against humanity and genocide, which are international crimes, that threshold was not borne out by the evidence. But we are saying that independent and more intensive research needs to be done to discover, whether there was, in a sense, crimes against humanity.
Why Kisumu and Kisii counties?
Well, they were actually the 9 rounds of protests have affected several counties. At least 7 counties over the last 3 months have experienced, 7 out of 47 have experienced very intense moments of protests. But these 2 are primarily the strongholds of the Azimio opposition party. They're the strongholds of Raila Odinga, and in that sense they are very contested neighborhoods, and whenever the political parties speak and call for protests, these are traditional strongholds of their supporter base.
What has the President, William Ruto, said? I guess maybe before we actually go to what he has said in light of this violence, perhaps let's take a look, because you mentioned the rising cost of living that people are protesting against. What measures did he introduce that sparked the flame of this moment?
So there are a couple of triggers, I think, that have made this period even more intense. The first is the introduction of a taxation bill that is now an act of Parliament, and that bill received more than 1,000 memoranda from the public, and we have within our constitution the right to participate in public affairs. 1,000 memoranda were submitted to the National Treasury, and 80% of those did not support the tax measures that were being introduced. Unfortunately, the executive decided to proceed with this, and barring a legal suit that has just been concluded, the taxation policies are now in place, and they have increased taxation burden on a number of different parts of society. It is a progressive tax bill in the sense that it focuses on taxing those who are more wealthy, but the concerns has really been around value addition and I guess what you'd call the taxes that cut across all classes. So that's been one of the triggers. And then the second one, I think, has been the violence and the refusal to respect Article 37 of our Constitution that speaks to freedom of association. So that's the two major triggers that have propelled these protests and these strikes.
The word from the President?
Not yet. We are eagerly waiting his response to our report, and also the response of the Inspector General of the National Police Service. There are 16 recommendations. They're on our Twitter, or now we don't call it Twitter anymore, our X handle. So they have had an opportunity to look at those. So we do hope that there will be a response. It is one of the first times, I think, that there's been a joint mission of doctors, lawyers, and human rights defenders. So it is a significant piece of work, and we do hope that they will respond. But more importantly, that they will take the recommendations in good faith and actually implement them.
You spoke of when you asked people in Kenya whether they fear poverty or the police, and they cite the police. This is not a good combination, because poverty is also not an option. But when you take a look at the situation in Kenya beyond this moment, right, as we outlined in the beginning, that this is nothing new for the country, perhaps maybe 2 or 3 of those recommendations that you can highlight for our viewers that will help stave off this kind of response from the police?
Well, maybe just a comparative comment first. I mean, South Africa had protests exactly on the same day that our protests started, or our round of protests started. And we were very shocked, we were very surprised in Kenya to see how peaceful the South African protests were comparatively to the Kenyan ones. Last year, Civicus, the World Alliance, documented 12,000 protests, largely to do with economic grievances, and they spanned across 140 countries. So, you know, we are in the global protest season in many ways, and therefore protecting the protester is really important, and ensuring that those protests do not become violent and target others. But I think the recommendations that are most important, probably if I can just highlight 2. The first is that the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, Kenya and South Africa, have 2 of the only oversight authorities on the continent. But we are asking the Kenyan IPOA to essentially investigate all these cases, all these 10 deaths and 107 injuries, and prosecute not just the officers, but the commanding officers that sent them into people's communities to brutalize them. And then secondly, also, we are actually calling for another round of police reforms to ensure that the police operate within human rights principles and laws that they are already obligated to under our constitution.
How would you characterize the mood in Kenya today, or in Nairobi, at least where you are?
Well, it's a bit more peaceful in the sense that we have seen in this week the beginnings of a dialogue team that has been assembled by the Kenya Kwanza ruling coalition and the opposition coalition. So there is hope that the political side of this will essentially deal with I guess some of the issues that have been raised by the opposition. But I think most importantly is not to lose sight of the fact that Kenyans are really struggling. The cost of living is very high for many. Their unemployment is rife, and there are a lot of young people who just don't see any hope in the economy right now.
I do wonder, Mr. Houghton, if you would indulge me, because President William Ruto has been trending on the socials, if you will, because he's not a person that is shy to speak, especially on an international platform. And his utterances on an international platform, when you then describe the situation in Kenya when it comes to the cost of living, and we must be fair in the condemnation because I guess, also inherited some of the problems that the country is going through. But one cannot reconcile the man that he is on the international stage and the man that he is in that country. Is that a fair assessment?
I think there are a number of things. We do recognize that he has provided much needed African leadership within the international policy arena, particularly on climate change. We have to support the Kenyan government in that regard because climate change is a threat to us all. He has spoken very clearly and eloquently on issues of regional conflict and crisis, places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, and now Sudan. And all of that has to be applauded. And we have to ask him to apply those principles domestically on the issues of violent policing. And I think very short of a change of leadership and a change of strategy among the National Police Service is what we need. We also need the police service to remain independent, as the President recommended or promised the nation during the election campaigns, and not take orders from the executive, as it seems this has been the case over the last few months. So I think we can celebrate the President for what he's doing internationally, and also some of the things that he's doing nationally as well. I mean, it is the case that there are a number of advances in terms of focusing on the poor, but at the same time we can condemn and call for his urgent attention to the issues of violent policing of protesters.
Fair enough. Irungu Houghton is with Amnesty International in Kenya, joining us from Nairobi. Thank you very much for your time this morning.